Okay, so I figured somebody before me will talk about all the technical aspects of grid modernization. So I was wondering what I should talk about, and um, I kind of always think that grid modernization is a nice phrase, right? Because it doesn't matter what kind of a grid you have, you should certainly modernize it some more. So the question is, what does grid modernization mean? It's one thing, it means something different, I would think, that if you're in the middle of Chicago, or if you're 100 miles out of Nairobi. I think the grid looks very different from each other, right? So, this picture, well, I think the lighting is such that you can't see it, but most of you have seen this picture of satellite at night of the globe. And everybody looks at this and says, oh, this is a nice picture. You can tell where the people live, or you can tell how economically advanced the particular parts of the globe are, okay? But this also gives you an idea where you need modernization, all right? So as I said, so then the question is that if you're in, let's say, North America or Western Europe, and now China and India have very, very modernized grid, would you do the same thing there as you would in the middle of Africa, where there are people without electricity, okay? And I think there's a kind of a thing that, well, let me just tell you the story. The first time you hear about the grid should be all integrated all over the world, and about 3 years ago at a secret conference, I remember the state grid people came from China, and they had this vision of having a grid, a fully integrated grid, all the way from the Chinese Pacific coast to the European Atlantic. Okay, and there are so many advantages of doing that because of the diversity and timing and what the load profile would be and all of that. So, on the other hand, last October, somebody mentioned COP22 this morning. I was invited to the COP22, the UN Framework Conference on Climate Change, and they had a sustainable grid workshop, and I talked about modernizing grids. But there were lots of people there who very firmly believed that if you're in, say, these areas where there was hardly any infrastructure, you shouldn't start with an infrastructure. You should start with microgrids, right? So now consider that. On the one hand, we are talking about intercontinental grids. There's talk about a whole grid that will ring around the Mediterranean. There are grids now that, even in Africa, people are talking about a South African grid that takes up all the way from South Africa to the middle of Africa, and so on. On the other hand, people are saying, well, let's go to the edge and just start with microgrid. So what is it really that we're going to see? So this is a sort of an advanced grid. This is the US transmission system, and you can see what that looks like. But what is a microgrid? I think we all pretty well know what a transmission grid looks like. That's another interesting term, microgrid, right? Everybody seems to have a different definition of a microgrid. So let me tell you that last summer, I was in China, and my friends that I collaborate with there said, we want to show you this microgrid, which we designed a tremendous controller for. And so we flew up to middle of nowhere, Inner Mongolia. And what they had there was 2 sources of generation and 1 load. And they were optimizing, and they could connect to the main grid. And they were optimizing the 2 sources of generation because one was wind, all right? But the load was 1,400 megawatts, one load, 1,400 megawatts. It was an aluminum factory. And 2 generators. One was about 1,800 megawatts, coal. There's lots of coal up there in Inner Mongolia. And 300 megawatts of wind farms. The microgrid took up many, many miles of space, and in between you saw these big, huge coal pits that people were saying. And I said, but why do you call it a microgrid for 2,100 megawatts? And so they said, well, it meets all our definition of a microgrid. It's got generation, it's got load, it's got controllers, it's got... So I said, well, okay, nobody defines it by the number of kilowatts or watts or whatever, but the question is, the reality of all this is, what is the future going to look like? Is it going to be lots and lots of microgrids? Or is it going to be these very large intercontinental grids? And the answer is probably in between, right? The only thing that I leave you with is maybe, you see, India and China, as the grid grew, their main way of meeting this, everybody's ideal of getting 24/7 electricity to everybody, is to essentially go the top-down route. Take the transmission grid and start expanding it to the point where you can hang distribution lines down to every hut in every village, right? And maybe that's not the best way to do it. As many of the NGOs and now many corporations like ABB are finding out that there's a big market for microgrids. So you start microgrids isolated all over areas where people don't live, and then you start connecting them as they still fit. So a more organic way of getting to the future grid. See, finally, you interconnect for the same reason. We have always interconnected. One is economy. You can exchange power, and let me show you why that's going to continue. Everybody talks about solar and wind, right? But these are not available everywhere. This is in the US, the solar power is all in the Southwest. So if you're going to get that solar power somewhere else, you'll have to have transmission. This is the wind. It's even worse. The wind in the US is all in the middle, where nobody lives. All the people live on the coast. The only way you're going to get the power out of the Midwest, do it with transmission. So, you connect, you interconnect because of economics, and you interconnect because you can back up each other for reliability. That doesn't go away. So even if you start with microgrids, there's always incentives to interconnect, right? So the future grid will be a combination, and it depends on the region, it depends on what kinds of generation resources you have available to you, and the general condition of the economics, all right? So that's sort of my view of what the future brings. It depends on where you are, all right? Now, let me just make a couple other points. Sorry. So for the developed countries, right now there is very little load growth, all right? So there's not going to be a huge amount of infrastructure investment, right? Whereas on the developing countries, that's where you're going to see the load growth, large amounts. Both Europe and America, actually the US, finally this year came up to the same maximum load as we had in 2007, all right? So so there's been no load growth, and in fact, negative load growth for a while. So now the main thing about all this, it doesn't matter which area you are in, the developing countries or developed, is the one thing that is readily available to both is all the ICT, all the information and communication technologies, which have come down in price so much that you can get it into everything. Sensors. So people are now putting in sensors, computers, communications, control software, all of that. of all the things, well, so now here's the issue. It's much cheaper if you put those in when you're building the system. If you build a new substation, you can put in all the ICT for almost very low incremental cost. For North America, for Western Europe, for existing substations, it's a retrofit. It's much more expensive, and it's hard to do, which is why today you're seeing thousands of PMUs being put into China without fanfare, whereas in the US, people are writing hundreds of papers about the 1,700 PMUs, the 1,400 PMUs that have been put into North America. So that's the situation in terms of reality. So you're going to see a lot more ICT go into the developing countries much faster. So, and as I said, the generation technologies, generation costs the most, transmission costs lower, and ICT costs even lower than that. So usually ICT is somewhere between 1% and 2% of generation and transmission. So in terms of strategy, whenever you want to put in ICT anywhere, everywhere you can, and that's the whole idea of the smart grid, and I think modernization, grid modernization today means that to us. Finally, I leave you with this thought that what is driving modernization today is not the technology and not the economics, but government policy. See, why the RPSs, or what, the drive towards low carbon, the only way to get there is with government policy. So, so whether some place gets nuclear, whether some place gets more coal or less coal, is all government policy. I mean, the nuclear is probably the most interesting to me, because you find all over the globe, everybody is taking completely different policy, all right? In the US, there's no nuclear coming up. And in Asia, lots of nuclear coming up. In Europe, they seem to be going in both directions. France is going in one direction, and Germany is going in a different direction. So take your pick, but the engineers will have to adjust to whichever policies people make. So 3 points I made, and I'm going to leave you with that. First is the alternative grid futures. We're going to see all the alternative grid futures, okay? So in the US, we're talking about alternative facts at the moment, but alternative futures also are going to be right there. Smart grid, it's a good thing. That's why we have these kind of symposiums. But here's the thing. Retrofitting is going to be expensive. But greenfield, it's a no-brainer. You must put in all the ICT you can right in the beginning. And then finally, the government policy, nobody can predict what's that going to be. Change in administration can bring in lots of changes in policies on energy, and we're still waiting to see what changes are going to come to the US. But the technology and the economics, those are, of course, still important, because as you know, as I think somebody pointed out this morning, if suddenly storage became very cheap, suddenly the whole picture changes. And then I'll leave you with this thought. I spent a couple of years in the Department of Energy, our Ministry of Energy, working on the grid, on the national grid. And during that period, the generation mix in the US in 2 years' time went from coal at 50% to coal at 33%. So it went down. The use of coal went down. It had almost nothing to do with government policy, because what happened was natural gas prices in the US plummeted. Everybody shifted from coal to natural gas, and suddenly we were producing much more energy in natural gas than with coal. Now, of course, the government took full credit for it, and the US suddenly started meeting all its commitments for clean air. Europe, that didn't happen. Natural gas prices didn't go down. In the meantime, they decided to start shutting down nuclear, using more brown coal, and they didn't meet any of their, much of the promises made on clean carbon didn't work out in Europe. So suddenly you had President Obama taking credit for bringing down the greenhouse gases in the US because we started using more natural gas, which was not exactly what the environmentalists wanted in the first place. So that's how life works with policy and economics, and the real world goes on. Thank you very much.